Hi, everybody. It's Scott Leckie from Democracy Tomorrow. This will be a rather detailed video about a really important question, and that is essentially, should politicians have to pass tests before they are given the right to run for elected office? Almost every single profession that has a direct bearing upon anyone else in society, which if mismanaged could cause harm to another person in society, is required to pass at least some degree of a test before they're able to practice their profession. Would we ever want a doctor to operate on us if we knew they hadn't been through training and many years of apprenticeship before they finally made it to the operating room? Would we really want an engineer to design a bridge before they completed their degree and passed a number of other tests that showed their expertise in the field of engineering? Would we want nurses treating us if we knew they had not been to basic medical training and offered other educational opportunities to ensure the highest standard of care? Would we want factory workers to produce our cars or food products or anything else in the factories if we knew that they had not been properly trained to do so in a safe and healthy manner? Would we want financial advisors to give financial advice if they didn't have some degree of training or educational attainment, passing tests, in other words, before giving advice that could literally ruin clients if they give the wrong advice? Would we want even our car mechanic to work on our car if they hadn't had some degree of training to develop the expertise needed to fix a vehicle? And the list goes on. So many professions cannot be practiced unless a basic test or series of tests are passed before they are able to do their jobs that could potentially greatly harm very large numbers of people if they were carried out poorly. So today we're going to talk about the idea of limitations on politicians. Should anybody be able to run for office in either a local election, a national election, or one day an international election when we have a global government in place? Or is it more reasonable to put into place certain rules, certain limitations as to who can run for office? And should there also be a series of tests that can be applied against each prospective candidate prior to running for office? Now, when it comes to voting, which we'll discuss very briefly here, the basic principle, of course, is that everybody in society should be able to participate in free, fair, and secret voting processes leading to the election of whatever government the election is about, local, national, etc. There are some legitimate limitations that can be placed on voting rights. Independently determined mental incapacity is one. Obviously, there are age limits. Most countries tends to be 18 years of age. Some countries are pondering a move towards 16 and above will be given the legal right to vote. But these days, mostly in those countries where voting is fully allowed, it's usually 18 and above. Some countries restrict voting rights by convicted felons. Very, very few. I only know of one, actually. Look it up. But that does also occur. But the general principle is everyone should be able to be an active participant within a representative democracy and participate within relevant elections. As I've mentioned before in earlier broadcasts, countries like Australia and others have a compulsory voting system where every single person is required to cast a vote and participate in all elections. So that's voting. Now, what about politicians? Who can anybody run for office who wants to do so? Now, there are international rules on this, and there are most certainly national and local state laws, local laws regulating this. Without giving a comprehensive overview, some of the limits are, of course, the person running for office has to be a citizen in most countries before they can run. There's usually also an age limit, like with voting, often 18 to run for lower level offices, and then sometimes 25, sometimes 35 to go for higher level offices. In some countries, You can't be a dual national and run for office. You have to negate one of your nationalities if you're a dual national in order to be elected, for instance, in Australia. So you can only be an Australian citizen to run for office in Australia. You can't be a dual national. And I believe that applies to a number of other countries too. In some countries, you cannot have been convicted of treason and then run for office. In other countries, you cannot run for office if you're under sentence for punishment of more than a year, sometimes 5 years, for various crimes. You cannot run for office in some countries if you are legally bankrupt. You cannot run for office if you take a fee for services as a government official, i.e., taking bribes and engaging in corruption. Some countries you cannot run for office if you are a judge, particularly for a lifelong appointment. Some countries restrict running for office if you're a civil servant, and so on. There are restrictions in place. Most, not all of these are extremely reasonable, but is it enough? Is it enough just to have rules of that nature when it comes to the politicians that guide us? Now, some may find the idea of creating limits on politicians an unsavory and impossible method to apply in the real world, where politicians, by the very nature of the political system that we have, tends to be occupied by people of a certain psychological type. People who are charismatic, people who are very energetic, people who believe deeply in the ideas that they are pursuing, and so forth. There are many, many people in society, myself included, who would never run for political office for all sorts of reasons. So it does attract a small subsection of society who will actually run for office and, in the best case scenario, act in the public interest for the public good, trying to achieve betterment for society as a whole. In a recent book that I wrote with my friend and colleague Pablo Rueda, we proposed ideas that we hope people will discuss and debate about how to improve the electoral process now, so that when we do eventually reach the idea of a global governance system in which everyone participates globally in influencing policy and global law in relevant ways, which we will discuss in greater detail in future broadcasts. And we developed several basic principles that we hope could be debated and discussed, and then also 9 new criteria that could be applied to aspiring politicians everywhere. And we really hope that you will consider these and leave comments and discuss it with your family and friends, whether this is a good idea or not. We're just throwing ideas out there. We try to be very reasonable in our ideas, and they are designed to both provoke debate and discussion and put ideas out there that will ultimately be incorporated into the prevailing system of elections, voting, and governance. So we came up with 5 general principles, and these are going to be followed by 9 specific criteria for aspiring politicians. So the first one that we've come up with was the idea of alternating female and male leadership in both political parties and in terms of the heads of state. So this might be very difficult to do. This might prove an impossibility in certain ways, but can we at least consider it? As I mentioned in an earlier podcast, the Labour Party victory in Australia in the most recent election has led to a cabinet with more women than men for the first time ever, and the representation of women to men ratio in the parliament is higher than ever before, with women in the majority. So that happened without any rules, but it happened due to political persuasion, and because it's about time. There's very few parliaments in the world that have equitable gender representation. We believe all parliaments of the world should be able to achieve that. If it was built into the system where you had to have a man for, let's say, 5 years, and then you had to have a woman for 5 years, and then you had to have a man for 5 years, it would create a certain type of political dynamic, which people, we believe, would probably accept readily after a certain period of time. So that's one thing to consider. A second is 1 term and 1 term only. There's a lot of discussion right now about the length of time that individual leaders are seeking to govern particular countries. There are some leaders that have been in power for 20, 30 even more years right now on planet Earth. Obviously not subject, generally speaking, to the democratic will of the people. There are other countries where there are 2-term limits, and threats are being made right now that will be overturned and a 3rd term will be attempted by a current leader. There are many instances around the world of limitations on how many times a person can lead a country, and 1-term limits do exist in a whole range of countries. What if we had a 1-term limit across the world? That, in our view, would lead to a reduction in the chances of dictatorships forming or autocratic regimes forming. It would encourage far more participation in society by people that could potentially become future leaders to lead their countries because they knew that the 5-year period would be over, and so on. A friend of mine, a very good friend of mine in Geneva, Switzerland, the other day told me he had lunch with Lech Walesa, who led the Solidarity Trade Union in Poland in the 1980s, which was highly illegal, but it showed the popular will of the workers in Gdansk against the then communist government. And what Lech Walesa was saying during this lunch was that no leader anywhere, anytime should ever be allowed to govern for longer than 10 years. So his view was 10 years. We've proposed 5 years. It would not be difficult for the General Assembly or some international body to adopt a resolution or create rules that also followed a similar framework. Could be 5, could be 10. I would certainly say not more than 10. What do you think about that? 1 term and 1 term only. Thirdly, we propose to remove all private money from politics. Pure and simple. No $10 donations anymore. No 10 million donations anymore. No 250 million donations anymore. 0 private money in politics. Remove it entirely. Government is meant to govern in the interests of the public, in the interests of the people. Infusing private money into the political process is inherently corrupt. And in the end, it has impacts far beyond what people realize. So we keep it simple and we say, ban all private money from politics. That's our proposal. What do you think? Every financing opportunity open to political parties and individual candidates should be publicly financed and entirely transparent and at a very low level. That is our view. Fourth, to consider, at least now, the viability of a rotating head of state or a rotating presidency as an alternative to a single person heading a government. Now, it has been said by some, I've heard a joke, which is a pretty good joke. What is a camel? And the answer is a horse designed by committee. And it's pretty true. I get it. It's very hard to decide things as a committee as opposed to one person with whom the buck stops, famously. But the rotating presidency or rotating head of state idea is something that already exists in the world and has been tried in several places. It's the fundamental operating principle of the European Union, for instance. It rotates every 6 months between the 27 members of the European Union. You don't even hear about it because it's so widely expected. The presidency in Switzerland is also a rotating system today. So much so that very often people don't even know who the president is because of the rotation process. Usually the less you know about a head of state in terms of controversy and noise usually means they're doing their job quietly, diligently, effectively. Uruguay famously attempted it at the presidential level in almost the entire length of the 1950s, but abandoned it. But it was a tool, it was a method that they thought would prevent against the emergence of a dictator in a region in which too many dictators took power. So it's not a concept that's never been tried before. It's a concept that works today. What do you think about it for your own country? What do you think about it for any eventual global government? One of the key arguments that we completely understand against the idea of a world government in which all of us participate as fellow equal humans, where we have all transcended our pure identities as a national of a certain country and we see ourselves as fellow inhabitants of the same planet, is the danger, the very real danger, which exists in every single country in the world as well, by the way. In any governing system, there's always a danger that somebody will attempt to become emperor. Somebody will attempt to possess imperial power and create an empire under their own vision. And that's most certainly a danger at the international level were we to have a global system of governance. And no effort should be spared in order to prevent that from ever occurring. It's bad enough when it occurs in one of the 193 nation states that are members of the United Nations. But what if it occurred in the one single government? Just imagine the damage that could be wrought. And don't tell me there aren't leaders in the world this very minute who would wish for nothing more than to be that person, that singular human being on top of the global political power pyramid, doing whatever they wanted to the planet as a whole. That is the worst possible scenario we can imagine, and something that must be guarded against immensely. There should be no physical possible way that that could occur. If there is even a global head of state needed, we believe that only a very strictly regulated rotating system is the only way that it could actually work. So ponder that one too. And then finally, we believe that ministerial appointments, so the appointment of people to head ministries in various national and local governments, should not be based on personal connections with the leader or ideological similarities between the leader, but on proven technical expertise on the particular area concerned. So probably good to have a health professional running the Ministry of Health. Probably good to have somebody who understands housing issues deeply running the Ministry of Housing. Probably good to have somebody who knows about trade and business running a Ministry on Commerce and so on. Very often in the world today, political appointments are made to ministerial positions on the basis of personal connections and other concerns that are not in the best interests of the people. So those are just 5 general ideas that we think people should discuss and debate about improving overall democratic performance in countries. Now, we come to the end of today's podcast in proposing 9 new criteria that we believe should be applied to every single prospective politician anywhere in the world that have to be satisfied in order to be able to run for office. We don't believe it should be a free-for-all, subject to those few rules I mentioned before, citizenship, age, etc. But it should be much more specific and refined. Otherwise, we're going to start getting, and we already have, obviously, throughout history, a lot of insalubrious people running governments and causing havoc, not only nationally, but internationally as well. So what are the 9 new criteria that we propose are taken into account? I'll just go through them briefly. So for number 1 is they have never committed or been convicted of committing an internationally recognized war crime, crime against humanity, or human rights violation as defined under the Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court and prevailing international human rights treaties. No war criminals, no crimes against humanity, no human rights violations. That sounds like a pretty reasonable criteria to me. If you commit a war crime, you are no longer allowed to run for office, etc. That's number 1. Number 2, never having been impeached or otherwise legally removed while holding public office, nor convicted of fomenting insurrection, treason, or sedition. Well, I think that speaks for itself. That's also a very reasonable criteria against which prospective candidates could be tested. Third, they should provide all tax returns for the past 10 years to give the maximum level of financial transparency possible and to ensure that the person running for office is not acting in a fraudulent manner. Fourth, disclosed all beneficial interests in any business, company, investment, or other asset. In the present world, the way the global economic system works, it is simple beyond belief. We will do several podcasts on this in the future. To own companies and have no what's called beneficial ownership appear on any documents. So leader X of country Y can be the owner of company Z, and yet that person's name does not appear on any of the documents outlining the ownership of the company in question. When those companies are registered in tax havens, of which there remain dozens in the world, and subject to banking secrecy, which remains in place in many countries in the world, it is impossible to trace not only where the funds come from that are in the accounts of those unnamed non-beneficial ownership companies, but it's impossible to trace the origin and ultimate ownership rights associated with them. This has to end if we want to have a truly democratic system on Earth. Fifth, the prospective politician should have never been convicted of a major criminal offense, including homicide, assault, sexual crimes, or trafficking in persons or drugs. I think that makes perfect sense. Self-explanatory. Sixth, we believe every prospective candidate should sign a binding pledge of good governance, including the commitment to govern for one term and one term only, as we discussed. Seventh, we also believe that political leaders should never have served in the armed forces of their country or in any position as an officer or above. The military should be the military. Government should be government. There should be no merger between the two. The military should be under the complete and total control of the civilian government. That is what's needed in a democratic country. And this is one step that can help facilitate that. Eighth, there should be no familial relationship through blood, adoption, or marriage to any previous political leader within the past 30 years. This is designed, of course, to prevent family dynasties from emerging. Family dynasties are utterly destructive in most cases, not all, but in most cases, to the democratic system, and not something that should be encouraged and should, in fact, in our view, be strongly discouraged and, in fact, made unlawful. Having power as a president of a country or a prime minister, grooming one's own son in order to be the next prime minister or president is inherently destructive to the democratic process and something that should be banished forever. There are so many instances of this around the world. Do a survey yourself of where this has happened and see what the outcome has been. Not very pretty. And finally, and in many respects most importantly, in this incredibly unequal world in which we live, any aspiring politician should have a net worth of less than 20 million US dollars. Some would argue that number should be reduced to 10 million or 5 million, or maybe even 2 million, or maybe even less than that. But there should be a fundamental disconnect between obscene levels of wealth and ability to control the political processes in a country. Exceedingly wealthy people should be excluded from the political decision-making process other than acting as voters. This is the only way to ensure that politics, as we know it, represents the true interests of the people and not the interests of those who are running the show. So maybe 20 million is too much. What do you think? Maybe 10 million? Maybe 1 million? There's 60 million millionaires in the world today. It's about 1% of the global adult population. But there are 4.5 billion people who have less than 8,000 US dollars to their name. We live in one of the most, if not the most, unequal times in the history of humanity. Something has to be done about this. We have allowed this situation to occur. We'll speak about this in great length in future episodes. But for the moment, let me end it there. That's the 9th of the 9 criteria for political leadership that we would like to propose. What do you think? Let us know. Maybe it's pie in the sky. Maybe it's time to actually implement these things. We really welcome your comments. And thank you very much for watching Democracy Tomorrow.